Okay, well then we can move on to what you're all here for, and that is our guest professor, Dr. Julian Keil. To those of you who don't know him yet, I'd like to briefly introduce him. Dr. Julian Keil received his PhD from the University of Constance in 2012, and during his doctoral studies, he also spent some time working at the Institut at the University of Montreal. From 2012 until 2017, he then conducted his postdoctoral studies at the well-known Charité in Berlin. And since 2017, he holds the position of junior professor for biological psychology at the Christian Albrechts University here. And in 2018, he also obtained his habilitation at the Freie Universität Berlin. His research focuses on how ongoing oscillations and brain states shape perception. And I think that's also what we're going to learn about today. So thank you so much for joining us today. We're very happy to have you. And yeah, I'm also personally very excited to hear more about your work. And yeah, that said, I would say you can take over and the stage is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for your kind invitation, and thanks for hosting me here today and giving me the opportunity to tell you a bit about my research. And I hope you can all see my screen, so I hope you can all see the slides. So the title, as Laura Klatt already told you, is Brain State Dependent Multisensory Perception. And today I want to take you on a little journey that spans the last 10-15 years of my research. So to give you a bit of an insight into what I've been doing in the last few years, and also give you an outlook on some future plans that involve like future research ideas. If you want to read along these slides, and if you want to have a look at the references, you can download these slides under the URL you see down here. I'm not sure, can you see my mouse? Okay, so you see, so I'm circling the URL down here, so tiny URL. That gives you a link to my GitHub repository where you can download these slides and take a look at them at home or later on if you're still interested in the topic. So the topic brain state multisensory perception is a situation that deals with a situation that we are all in right now at the moment. So you see it on the slide that if we are in a situation like this right now, so we are attending a online seminar, we actually need to integrate visual and auditory information that arrive in our sensory system, that arrive in our brain from different sensory channels. And we need to decide which parts of our sensory environment we want to integrate into a subjectively coherent percept. So the question that we face in multisensory perception, multisensory integration, is the question whether to integrate or not to integrate sensory information. So in a situation like this, you are attending a Zoom conference and the speaker is, the picture of the speaker is coming from the front of you, but maybe the sound of the speaker is coming to you through headphones, as in my case, or through speakers next to your computer or somewhere else in the room. So you have to decide, is this information that is arriving from different spaces, from different origins in space, maybe with a slight temporal delay, is this coming from one source? Is it coming from one origin? And do you need to actually integrate this information into one coherent percept? Or is it more sensible, is it more helpful to keep this information separate and to process visual and auditory information as two different streams of information? So this pertains to the question whether we need to integrate information into one coherent percept. This question whether to integrate information or not can be operationalized with the question of, or with a research on congruent and incongruent information. So we can compare the processing and the perception of congruent and incongruent information. And this research, this way of targeting this research is quite a long history and a long tradition. And there are some really nice models on this multisensory integration. And the starting point of this research program is the question when and where multisensory signals are integrated into a coherent and conscious subjective perception. So the idea behind this question is, as we see here in a theoretical model proposed by Dirk Talsma, that different sensory information arrives in our brain from our different sensory channels, and this information is passed along multiple steps in a multi-stage model of sensory integration. And at each of these stages, at each of these processing stages, this information can be compared. So, for example, auditory and visual information can be compared and can be matched for example, for congruency. And at the same time, this information processing is influenced by for example, top-down goals and intentions, for example, attention or prior knowledge on the sensory information. However, in this theoretical model proposed by Dirk Talsma, it isn't really clear when and where, for example, congruency matching happens. So it's not really clear at what point in our sensory processing the information we receive right now, so auditory and visual information that arrive from different places in space, are actually matched for congruency and are compared with respect to whether we should integrate them or not. So it's not really clear when and where in the brain this happens. At the same time, Daniel Zenkowski proposed a multi-stage model involving different processing areas, so a network model involving auditory, visual, multisensory, and frontal cortical areas. And he suggested that this information processing travels from primary sensory areas up to multisensory integration areas and to frontal cortical areas, where this holistic, this integrated perception actually then occurs. But again, it wasn't really specific, wasn't really clear on the timing when this whole multisensory integration process actually happens. So to tap into this question, how multisensory integration is processed, for example, we can use congruent and incongruent information, for example, in an experimental paradigm such as the McGurk effect. So the McGurk effect is an experimental paradigm where we present auditory and visual information streams, again, just like in a situation right now, and we can then use congruent and incongruent visual and auditory information to change our perception. So for example, in the classic McGurk effect, we combine a video stream with an incongruent auditory stream and see how this incongruent visual information changes the perception of the auditory stream. So the idea is here to compare congruent and incongruent audiovisual perception to see where this, for example, congruency matching occurs that Dirk Talsma here proposed. So this work on the McGurk effect, for example, has been done by Virginie van Wassenhove and colleagues already in 2003. They showed that the perception of congruent versus incongruent audiovisual information is reflected in late evoked potential. So they used EEG to record the electrical activity in the brain coming from congruent and incongruent audiovisual information, and they proposed that this difference in the matching between congruent and incongruent information is reflected in late cortical potentials. And importantly, they also proposed that the timing of this late effect strongly depends on the ambiguity of the visual stimulus. So the easier it is to decide that auditory and visual information are incongruent, the earlier this processing should happen. So if auditory and visual information are clearly not the same, this congruency comparison should happen earlier, and the decision not to integrate this information should actually happen earlier. So this was a finding I was looking at a lot at the beginning of my when I did my PhD with Nathan Weiss and Konstanz, and so we thought, okay, that's a good idea. Let's just try to replicate this effect. Let's just build the same thing and see whether we can actually find the same thing. And we didn't. So we couldn't really replicate this effect, and we were really a bit stressed about this because we couldn't really think of a reason why the very well described experiment by Virginie van Wassenhove didn't work in our case. So luckily for me, my PhD student Yadira Romero, quite a few years later in 2016, actually managed to replicate this effect. So luckily for me, she was better than me, and she actually could show the same, more or less the same thing. Here, again, she could show that the difference between congruent and incongruent audiovisual speech is reflected in a late potential. Now here, I'm not super sure if you're all familiar with this data representation. It's a time frequency plot. On the x-axis, we see the time. On the y-axis, we see frequency, and color-coded is the energy in different frequency bands. So here, the red blob means increased power, increased energy in a certain frequency band. So here in the study by Yadira Romero, she used, again, ambiguous and unambiguous and clear audiovisual stimuli. Now she framed it a bit differently. So low here means low predictability. So this would be low predictability would be a very clear, very unambiguously different stimulus. High predictability would mean the other way around. So high predictability would mean these stimuli are clearly different. Low predictability would mean it's rather difficult to tease these two apart. And she could again show more or less the same thing that Virginie van Wassenhove already showed, that in a case where we can clearly distinguish, where we can clearly differentiate auditory and visual information, we see this congruency matching process that Dirk Talsma proposed in this late potential around 300 milliseconds. So we find this comparison process, but only for highly predictive, modulated by the ambiguity of this stimuli. So coming back to the study of my PhD, where I actually failed to replicate this effect. Sometime later, I think we found a solution why this didn't work, and the reason why we couldn't replicate this effect and why this didn't work was that we actually built our audiovisual stimuli to be as ambiguous as possible. So again, we see here, so this effect only works in low ambiguous stimuli when they are very predictive, very clear, and we actually built audiovisual stimuli that were as ambiguous as possible. So this was work actually done by Niklas Eason, who's now in Bangor in Wales. And he built these videos all starting with the same syllable. So it wasn't really possible for our participants to actually predict what's going on. It was very ambiguous, and this resulted in so here in this case this mismatch detection effect didn't really work. So this mismatch this mismatch comparison, congruency comparison didn't really work. What we also found in this study, it was published in 2012, that our illusion rate in this McGurk effect was very, very low. So if you compare our illusion rate of around 50% here with the original paper by McGurk and MacDonald, they showed an illusion rate of around 80%. So a lot higher, very much higher susceptibility of their participants to this illusion. So in our case, the illusion didn't really work as intended, but like as an accident, inadvertently, we found a stimulus combination that resulted in a more or less bistable perception. So we had audiovisual stimuli that were very ambiguous and in which the perception of these stimuli in the participants wasn't really defined by the stimulus properties, but must have been defined by something else. And so we were looking at, okay, what's defining the stimulus perception in this case? And that's how we ended up with the idea of brain state dependent perception. Right around that time, around 2012, a number of papers already showed that the brain state influences visual perception. So around that time, very influential papers by, for example, Hanneke van Dijk or Kyle Matthewson showed that the alpha band power in the visual cortex critically influences how the same stimuli are perceived. And so we thought, okay, well, maybe the same thing happens in multisensory integration and multisensory perception as well. So we compared the neural activity prior to stimulus onset. So we compared the baseline activity before we actually show the audiovisual stimuli between perceptions where participants later on perceived this McGurk illusion or perceptions where participants separated auditory and visual information into different streams. So again, this is a time frequency representation. Here we have our x-axis. Now we're a negative time, so we're at the baseline prior to stimulus onset. Time point 0 is stimulus onset. And here so keep in mind, we compare the perception of physically identical stimuli. So the stimulus is always the same, but the perceptual outcome is something else. And here, what we found here is that actually the power in the beta band, a little effect also in the alpha band, but mostly here in the beta band, in sensory and here precuneus in multisensory integration areas, influences how this ambiguous incoming information is then processed. So here we see that the brain state, as reflected in the oscillatory power in the beta band, influences our perception. So to quickly summarize this first part of our journey, we've seen that multisensory integration involves multiple steps. That is what, for example, Dirk Talsma has proposed, and a number of studies show that multisensory integration is a multi-stage process involving different processing steps, from sensory processing and then comparison and then finally multisensory integration. And we've seen that this multisensory integration and, for example, the congruency matching depends on the stimulus properties. So depending on the stimulus properties, we can rely on the bottom-up information that is arriving in our perceptual system to decode this information and to make a decision whether to integrate or not to integrate this information. But we've also seen that in case of ambiguous, so in case of hard to decide, hard to decode multisensory stimulation, multisensory stimuli, the brain state actually influences the fate, the perceptual fate of these stimuli, influences how this information will be processed. However, when we wrote up this whole study on the brain state, we received the feedback, so from talks and from reviewers, we received the feedback, that speech stimuli are a bit difficult and so are a bit problematic to use in these kind of stimuli, in these kind of analyses, because speech stimuli are very complex and require very detailed processing to actually decode. So in speech stimuli, you have mouth movements, you have very subtle differences in in changes in a facial configuration that could give away clues of what's already happening. So this is so it's a bit of a difficult stimuli set to actually tap into the real mechanisms of what is going on here. So the next step was to try to make the whole story simpler. So we were looking for a multisensory integration paradigm that was as simple as possible. And that's how we ended up with the so-called sound-induced flash illusion. So the sound-induced flash illusion has been around for now 21 years. It's been first proposed by Leighton Shams and colleagues, and it consists of the presentation of short auditory and visual stimuli. It's just a combination of short auditory and visual stimulation. So in essence, it's a very simple visual discrimination task. So the participants are asked to decide whether they have seen 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 visual stimuli. And so these stimuli are very salient in isolation. So you're sitting in front of your screen, it's a gray screen, and a bit below the center of the screen, a white circle appears. And then about 60 to 100 milliseconds later, another white circle appears, and you just have to decide, was that 1 circle or was it 2 circles? So it's a very, very easy task. There's no ambiguity. So in isolation, participants are usually very, very good at just doing the visual task in isolation. So have hit rates around 90–95%. So very easy to actually do this task. What makes this stimuli ambiguous and what makes this task interesting is adding the auditory stimuli in this case. So in the sound-induced flash illusion, we add multiple auditory stimuli at the same time. And this creates congruent or incongruent combinations of audio-visual stimuli. And in the classical case, we present 1 visual stimulus alongside 2 auditory stimuli with a SOA of around 60 milliseconds. And this stimulus combination can now result in 2 different perceptions. One correct perception, which would be, okay, I've just seen 1 visual stimulus. 1 visual stimulus was presented and I only perceive 1 visual stimulus. Or this stimulation can result in an illusion, in the sound-induced flash illusion, in which the participants actually perceive 2 visual stimuli, so they perceive a second illusory stimulus. This is a paradigm that's been used in a ton of studies. It's been summarized last year. It's been very nicely summarized by Rebecca Hurst in a review paper. She did a tremendous job in summarizing all these different studies on the sound-induced flash illusion, and also includes, this review paper includes this very nice figure in which we see that if the stimulus onset asynchrony between the first and the second stimulus is around 100 milliseconds, we can actually induce this illusion. And across studies, we see that the illusion rate is roughly around 50%. So this means this again, we have a bistable audio-visual stimulation paradigm in which we can use the identical audio-visual stimulation, which will then result in different audio-visual perceptions, depending on who knows what, probably the brain state. So in this case, we can use 2 different kinds of illusions. We have the fission illusion, which I've just shown you, which is the combination of 2 auditory and 1 visual stimulus, which will result in the illusion of 2 visual stimuli. Or we can have the so-called fusion illusion, in which we use 1 auditory and 2 visual stimuli, which results in the perception of 1 stimulus. And what you can see here, that in this, in theory, in isolation, very easy visual discrimination task is actually influenced by our auditory perceptions. The auditory information influences our visual perception because the illusion follows the auditory information. So if we then again use the same approach as we've done in the McGurk effect and McGurk illusion, we can compare the perception of the illusion versus the correct, the no illusion case, and can analyze what's happening in the brain during the perception of this illusion. And what we have seen in different studies, and what has also been shown in earlier studies, for example by Jyoti Mishra, is that the perception of the illusion goes hand in hand with an early increase in gamma band power. So if this incongruent audiovisual perception is actually integrated into this illusion, then we see this increase in gamma band power, this early increase in gamma band power, and the power of this gamma, so the individual power of this gamma peak is correlated with the illusion rate. So in participants who have a stronger increase in gamma band power, the illusion rate actually is also stronger, and this effect is localized here to our extrastriate visual cortex and superior temporal gyrus. So these multisensory integration areas likely reflect this integration of auditory and visual information. If we then again move to the pre-stimulus, to the baseline, to see whether the brain state influences our perception, we see a similar effect as we've seen in the McGurk illusion. So again, the brain state influences the fate of this multisensory, of this audio and visual information, and influences how this audio-visual information will be processed. So these are studies done by me, by my PhD student Mathis Kaiser, and by our colleague Jo Lange from Düsseldorf. And across these different studies, we see that the ongoing oscillations, the ongoing power in the beta and alpha band influences our perception. So Jo Lange showed that reduced alpha band power, in the classical sense, reduced alpha band power indicates increased excitability in the visual cortical areas, predicts the perception of the illusion. And Mathis Kaiser and we showed that beta band power in higher cortical areas, so for example here in our STG, also predicts multisensory integration. So it looks like that we have different cortical areas in different states that make it so that that predict the integration, the subsequent integration of these audiovisual stimuli. So depending on the state of the brain prior to stimulus onset, the multisensory integration will be integrated or will be processed separately. That isn't the only effect we found in the pre-stimulus interval, but we also found that the frequency of the alpha band oscillation influences how multisensory integration is integrated. So here we correlated the individual alpha frequency. So we detected the peak frequency of our participants, so the individual alpha band peak frequency, and correlated this with the illusion rate. And here we've seen that in participants who have a higher individual alpha frequency, the illusion rate is actually lower. Again, this is a finding that has been that has been shown before by Roberto Cecchero in the same paradigm, and has now also been replicated in a recent paper showing that the increased alpha band frequency goes hand in hand with a reduced illusion rate. And we interpreted this finding as an example of how the ongoing phase of an alpha oscillation opens up windows of temporal integration, and a slower frequency, so a slower alpha frequency represents larger, so it represents longer integration phases in which auditory and visual information can be integrated. So a slower oscillatory frequency represents a larger temporal binding window, which makes it more likely to actually integrate this audiovisual information. In contrast, here in a higher individual alpha frequency, this temporal binding window is shorter. So this makes it more likely that auditory and visual information fall into different excitatory phases and will then be processed separately. So to summarize this second part, this second step of our journey, we found that as we've seen in the McGurk effect, also in this very, very simple sound-induced flash illusion, we found that multisensory perception actually depends on the brain state. We've seen that the bottom-up information, auditory and visual information, can be integrated, can be fused to a coherent, subjectively coherent percept, as in the illusion, and this perception of this integrated audio-visual perception is reflected in induced gamma band power. More importantly, we see that the ongoing state of the brain, the ongoing oscillations in the alpha and beta band actually influence sensory encoding and sensory processing. So we can think about this as a top-down state of the brain. So that our top-down influence on our brain state actually influences how we will perceive multisensory integration. So coming back to this multi-stage model that Dirk Talsma proposed, we can think of multisensory integration again as a multi-stage process. So we have our input that will be encoded, we have to make a perceptual decision, and we have to respond to this multisensory integration. And depending on the input, the bottom up, so our perception will be governed, will be guided by the bottom up, the incoming information, or will be influenced by top-down processes, different top-down influences. So that is a nice idea. It's all very nice that we can say, well, the brain state influences perception, but we still don't really know what this brain state actually is. So all we know is that, okay, it's alpha band power, it's beta band power, it's the alpha band frequency somewhere in the sensory cortices and multisensory integration areas. But what is it actually? What is this brain state that influences our perception? So to answer this question and to answer whether we can actually change this brain state and to actually see whether we can change this brain state, my PhD student, Jorgos Michail, got the idea to modulate cognitive processes to change the brain state. So we already seen that if we manipulate the stimuli, we can change our perception. But we want to keep the stimuli fixed, you want to keep the stimuli identical and see whether we can change the brain state to change our perception. And his idea was to modulate cognitive processes, to limit the available cognitive resources, and to see how this limiting of cognitive resources will then be reflected in changes of the perception. So his idea was, if we have this balance between bottom-up and top-down influences, so whether our multisensory integration will be governed by bottom-up influences or top-down influences, top-down control mechanisms, he wanted to see whether we can tip this balance and see how changing the top-down control mechanisms will change our perception. So his idea was to combine the sound-induced flash illusion paradigm with a NBAC tasks. And I've just seen on Twitter that you have just published a very nice paper on this interruption of ongoing processes by the NBAC tasks. So that's what we actually did here, but we didn't actually think about that we are actually interrupting processing by the NBAC task, but we combined our sound-induced flash illusion task with this NBAC task to limit the available cognitive resources, so to draw away cognitive resources from our main task, from our multisensory integration task. So we used the NBAC task in different levels. So we had the no-back task, which is just the basic sound-induced flash illusion, where we can see, okay, just the normal sound-induced flash illusion, as we've seen before, results in a roughly 50% illusion rate. And then we've used a zero-back task, where participants just had to detect the letter X presented between trials. So it was just more or less an attention task. And then we had a one-back and a two-back condition, where we increased the cognitive load. So we increased the difficulty of this orthogonal secondary task. And what we see here is that by drawing away cognitive resources from our main task, so by drawing away cognitive resources available to process this incongruent audiovisual information, we actually see an increase in the illusion rate here. So we see that the n-bag task increased the cognitive load and depletes the available cognitive resources, and this actually increases the illusion rate in the sound-induced flash illusion. And we interpreted this finding as an indication that multisensory integration is our default mode. It's our standard mode. So in a normal and an everyday situation, it makes sense to integrate auditory and visual information, and actually separating this information is a active, effortful process. And so if I take away cognitive resources from this process, I don't have I limit my available cognitive resources, and I fall back to my default mode, my default behavior of integration. So, and this results in a stronger likelihood to actually perceive the sound-induced flash illusion. And so the next step for Yorgos was to see what's happening in the brain when we do this task. So we took this task, moved to the EEG lab, and replicated our own experiment. Luckily for us, we could replicate our behavioral effect. So this time we were on the safe side. We could see, okay, if we do this the same task again, we see the same finding. Again, here cognitive load increased the sound-induced flash illusion. And when we look at the post-stimulus processes that go along with the interaction between perception and cognitive load, we see that the perception of this multisensory integration is reflected in different processing stages, which are reflected in different signatures of neural oscillations. So we see that theta and beta band power reflect this interaction between cognitive load and the multisensory integration. So at first, we see an early beta band power increase that is mainly driven by this difference between illusion and no illusion trials in the zero bag condition. So in our standard sound-induced flash illusion condition, we see that the illusion perception it goes hand in hand with an increased high beta band power. So this is more or less the same thing as we've seen before in the studies by Johanna Balz, where we see that the perception of the illusion goes hand in hand with an increased, in her case, it was gamma band power, here it is beta band power, but it's an early high frequency power effect that probably reflects this congruency matching between auditory and visual information. This doesn't really happen doesn't really happen here in the high load condition, but what we see in the high load condition is these two later processing stages, so a first alpha band, theta band effect and a later beta band effect, all originating from frontal cortical areas that, in our view, likely reflect this effortful stimulus analysis. So in the case of reduced cognitive resources, it's harder for our participants to make sense of this incongruent auditory and visual information, and it's harder for them to actually decode a subjectively coherent perception from this incongruent information. And this more effortful process actually requires requires stronger cognitive control, as reflected in these frontal cortical processes here in the theta and the beta band. So to summarize this third part of my talk, we again see that multisensory perception depends on the brain state, and we can actually change the brain state by manipulating cognitive processes. So depleting the cognitive resources influences multisensory integration, but not necessarily the initial stimulus processing, as we've seen in the first in this first effect. So the initial stimulus processing for illusion and no illusion trials was more or less identical in this case. But increasing cognitive load, so drawing away cognitive resources, leads to an increased demand of top-down resources. So that's what we've seen in this frontal cortical processes in the theta and beta band. So that reflects this increase in top-down resources to resolve the intersensory conflict to a subjectively coherent perception. So we summarize these findings again in our multi-stage process, and we've seen this balance between bottom-up and top-down processes. So in cases where we have high cognitive resources, so we are in a relaxed state, we have low task demands, high cognitive resources, and there's little conflict between auditory and visual information. So as we've seen in the McGurk effect, so when the stimuli are very clear, then our perception is guided by the incoming bottom-up sensory information. However, in cases where there is high conflict between auditory and visual information, or where we have low available resources, we need an increase in top-down control mechanisms, so an increase in top-down influences to actually resolve this intersensory conflict, so resolve this difference between auditory and visual information to a coherent perception. So that's the stage where we are right now. And now the big problem we are facing is the question whether modulating cortical activity and modulating the brain state using cognitive processes is actually a good idea. So your paper from today is actually falls right into place, because there we see that using the NBAC task as an orthogonal task might not be such a good idea, because we have a task switch situation, so it might not be super elegant to examine multisensory integration in such a task switch situation. So the next step for me would be to use a more indirect measure of changing the indirect way of changing the brain state. And here I stumbled upon the idea of stochastic resonance. This idea of stochastic resonance is coming from physics, and in short describes that adding noise, so integrating noise into a complex system, can actually improve the information transfer in this system. And this idea of stochastic resonance has been used, for example, in clinical psychology, in ADHD research, showing that ADHD patients actually get better in attention tasks when they are listening to auditory noise. So this is actually so I thought it's a quite interesting finding, also from the perspective of applied psychology, for example, as in workplace psychology. So actually adding noise, adding a distracting, for example, in layman's term, a distracting stimulus to our task can actually improve perception. And the same thing has been shown by Stefanie Gleis and Kaiser in a EEG paper, where they used a visual detection task. So the participants had to detect these very faint Gabor patches, and the authors, they added white noise stimulation to this task. And they could show that adding a white noise to this stimulus detection task actually reduced the perceptual threshold. So participants actually got better with increasing white noise stimulation. And this went hand in hand with a decrease in alpha band power. So adding white noise to this very boring stimulus detection task improved perception and reduced the alpha band power in visual cortex in this case. So we thought about, hey, that's a nice idea. Let's just try this out, and let's just apply this to the sound-induced flash illusion. So this was work done by a diploma student of mine, by Ida Zimmermann, and we're just in the process of writing this up. And here we combined the sound-induced flash illusion with different levels of white noise stimulation. And we see a similar thing here, that increasing the white noise stimulation actually improved our visual perception as it decreased the illusion rate. So a similar process, adding white noise to the stimulation, changed the brain state and actually improved the visual perception. And we see an interesting effect. So we see this a U-shaped relationship, and this U-shaped relationship has also been proposed by the original authors and the original proponents of the stochastic resonance idea. So related to this famous Yerkes-Dodson law, that intermediate stress levels should be beneficial for performance. They proposed that intermediate noise levels should actually be optimal for perception. And we see a hint of this effect here in this U-shaped relationship, that actually intermediate noise is optimal for our visual perception. With increased noise, this again, we see an increase in the illusion rate. So visual perception is actually again dominated by auditory stimulation. So to summarize this whole idea that I've just formulated in a grant application to the DFG, I would argue that we have, in our multisensory perception, we see an interplay between neural excitability, arousal, and cognitive control mechanisms that influence, so that represent the brain state and that influence our multisensory perception. So at the lowest level, we see fluctuations of cortical excitability. That's what we've seen in these theta alpha band fluctuations, where we see phases of high and low cortical excitability, and stimuli that fall in different phases will be processed differently. At the same time, we see phasic changes of the power. So that's what we've seen in the McGurk effect and the sound-induced flash illusion, where we see episodes of increased and decreased beta band and alpha band power that influence our perception. So we see phasic changes of cortical activity. So we switch between control and default modes that define how we process auditory and visual information. And at the same time, we see changes in tonic alertness. So across our experiments, so across the course of our experimental sessions, we see changes, we see slow changes of tonic alertness between focused and distracted states that again influence our perception. And I would argue that this whole relationship between neural excitability and changes in the brain state at different levels is influenced on the one hand by task demands and our available cognitive resources. So we have to decide whether we want to exert a lot of control or no control. So whether we are able to exert control or whether we are overwhelmed by the task. And at the same time, it is influenced, as we've seen in this idea of stochastic resonance, by arousal, which can be modulated by, for example, white noise stimulation. And again, here we have to find an optimal arousal level that will optimize perception. And we see these changes in perception, for example, as we've seen with intermediate white noise stimulation, that likely pushes arousal, and this arousal will then transfer to changes in neural excitability. So that's it. That was a quite extensive overview over my research across the last 15 years since my PhD, and I hope you got an idea, and I hope I could convince you that the brain state influences how we process and how we perceive multi-sensory integration. And now I'm happy for answers, I'm happy for comments and questions and criticism and all that. So thank you for your attention.